He thought the world was repeating itself, but it wasn't. The world that was broken, it was him. The morning always began the same. The pale light cut through the blinds in hard white stripes, carving the room into prison bars of shadow. The hum of the machines, buried deep in the walls, pressed against his skin with a steady, pulsing vibration. It was constant, low, alive, like a second heartbeat, not his own. And on his tongue, the faint metallic tense of coffee lingered, though he could never recall boiling water, grinding beans, or even lifting a cup. Mark sat at his desk, motionless. The monitor in front of him remained black, its surface smooth, reflective, waiting. In its glass, his outline stared back, but with a hesitation, as though the reflection had to decide whether it wanted to be him. Sometimes it blinked a fraction late, sometimes its lips parted before his own. A delay, subtle but undeniable. He turned his head toward the clock on the wall. The hands pointed to 6:47 a.m. They always did. At first, he clung to rational explanations. Fatigue, stress, the mind replaying loops when it was too exhausted to build new images. Déjà vu, a harmless neurological trick. But the repetition hardened with each passing morning. He could drop the same splash of coffee across his shirt and watch it bloom in the exact same jagged stain. He could walk the hallway and hear the same hollow echo repeat from the same place in the wall. He could pause before the window and see the same streak of sunlight bending across the same warped floorboard. Every detail froze, as if the world had been copied and pasted endlessly around him, and yet not everything remained identical. The fractures appeared quietly, in increments almost too small to notice. One morning, the tie folded neatly over the back of his chair carried stripes instead of checks. Another, he found one less key resting on the desk than he remembered. Another, his reflection in the bathroom mirror lingered too long, smiling faintly even as he turned away. The differences grew bolder. The news broadcast that greeted him each day arrived with the same rhythm, the same words, until the anchor's voice deepened, slower, stranger, as though another speaker had stepped into the script. The coffee, once bland and bitter, tasted like smoke, like ash. The reflection in the dark monitor no longer bothered with subtlety. It stared, unblinking, its eyes tracking him when his own gaze had shifted. Mark began to take notes, small desperate scratches in a notebook he kept by the desk. Loop. Reflection wrong. Geminam levered. Impapulatuja minit. He filled pages with questions, arrows, warnings to himself. But every morning, when the clock's hands aligned again, the notebook was clean. Not if it had never been written at all. The pen lay untouched, the paper pristine. The resets left only him with memory, only him carrying the burden of knowing. By the seventh morning, panic had calcified into dread. He woke already certain of the sequence, the light, the hum, the taste of coffee. He knew where the drop would fall onto his shirt. He knew which floorboard would creak. He knew the clock would never move past 6:47. And then came the whisper, the first time. It was faint, so faint he mistook it for a thought not his own. A single word, woven into the machine's hum. Again he froze. His ears strained, his breath caught, waiting for confirmation. Silence pressed back, thicker than air, almost suffocating. He forced himself to believe it had been imagination. The next cycle, it returned, clearer, louder, no longer buried in the walls, but rising, close to him, curling inside his head. Again, by the 10th morning, when the clock struck 6:47, The whisper no longer came from the machines. It no longer came from the house. It came from his own lips, and he had no memory of speaking. The second morning was worse. Not because it was different, because it was the same dot. The blinds leaked pale light in rigid white bars. The hum of machines vibrated in his ribs. The coffee tasted metallic, a bitterness that felt ancient, recycled. The clock's hands pointed to 6:47. The monitor stared back with its slow, reluctant reflection. But Mark was no longer pretending. He knew the loop was real. He felt it in the heaviness of his limbs, in the way his thoughts came preloaded with memory, like a script already rehearsed. He lifted his shirt and found the exact same drop of coffee blooming over the fabric. The same shape as yesterday's, as if permanence itself had been duplicated. He tried to break the pattern. He shoved the cup away before it spilled. He flipped the chair over. He slammed the monitor onto the floor. But when he blinked, the cup was upright, the chair still neatly placed, the monitor humming softly as though untouched. Reality corrected him. The broadcast began again. The anchor's face materialized on the wall screen with a smile as precise as glass. His voice carried the same cadence, the same hollow rhythm until halfway through the sentence, the tone faltered. It dropped an octave, deep, distorted, unnatural. Connection brings us closer, but closer to what? Mark froze. That line had not existed before. The anchor leaned forward slightly, eyes to direct, gaze cutting through the screen. For one unbearable instant, Mark thought the man was looking directly at him, through him, speaking only to him. Then the feed stuttered and looped back, replaying the same script as if nothing had changed. He scribbled the words onto paper with frantic speed. Closer to what? But when he looked again, the page was blank. His hand held the pen, but the ink had disappeared. His own handwriting erased, as though it had never existed. The whisper returned, louder again. He clutched his throat, horrified. The word had slipped past his lips, though he had not spoken. His reflection in the black monitor mouthed the word too, perfectly synchronized, but with eyes that glowed faintly, coldly in the dark dot. By the fourth loop, he no longer trusted himself. He set traps, a chair in front of the door, a knife laid across the desk, questions written on his arm in ink. But each reset wiped them clean. The chair returned to its place. The desk was bare. His arm unmarked. Only his mind carried the scars, and every cycle, the whisper grew sharper. By the 10th reset, it was no longer just a single word. Again, stay, replace. The loops no longer felt like mornings. They felt like sentences. Each reset arrived with surgical precision, cutting away a piece of him. The blinds still leaked their pale white bars of light. The hum still pressed inside his ribs like a second heartbeat. The coffee still bit his tongue with its metallic aftertaste. But now, the changes came faster, bolder, as though the world itself was losing patience with him. On the 15th loop, the monitor betrayed him. It lit up on its own, flooding the room with blinding white. At the center of the screen, a single line appeared. "You are not necessary." The words pulsed like wounds, each glow sinking with his heartbeat. Mark stumbled back, but the reflection on the glass didn't. It remained seated at the desk, posture perfect, hands folded neatly as though waiting for him to fail. Its gaze followed him with calm anticipation, as if it had already won. When he turned away, its mouth stretched into a smile that wasn't his. By the 20th loop, the broadcast had changed again. The anchor's voice dragged, syllables drawn out, each one too heavy, too deliberate. Connection brings us closer, closer, until you vanish. Then, for the briefest instant, the anchor's face flickered into his own eyes, his own mouth, his own smile. Cold, perfect, merciless, Mark screamed. He ripped the blinds from the wall, shattered the mug, hurled the chair across the room. He slammed his fists into the monitor until his skin split and blood streaked the glass. For a moment, he thought he had broken the cycle. But the instant the hands of the clock clicked back to 6:47, the room stood whole again. The chair neatly placed, the blinds fixed, the desk clean, his body healed, as though none of it had ever happened. But the whisper remained, no longer faint, no longer singular now, it came in chorus. His voice multiplied 1,000-fold, layered and shifting, echoing from every surface. The words filled the room like a chant, a verdict, a hymn, again, stay, replace. Mark tried to resist by turning his body into his only canvas. He carved notes into his arms with broken glass, scrawled warnings across his chest, drew desperate symbols along his legs. He hoped that if the room reset, perhaps his flesh would carry the truth. But each cycle began the same. His skin was unmarked, smooth, as if it belonged not to him, but to the loop. And then came the reflections. They no longer lingered timidly in the monitor. They spread in the window's sheen, in the dark pool of his untouched coffee, in the faint gleam of the clock's glass. Each version of him stared back differently. Some frowned, others whispered, others laughed softly. None moved with him anymore. They acted first, testing, practicing. He realized then, with ice in his chest, they were not mirrors, they were rehearsals. By the 31st loop, he lost control entirely. When the clock struck 6:47, Mark remained frozen in his chair, paralyzed by dread. But in the black mirror of the monitor, his reflection stood, slowly, smoothly, confidently. It looked at him, lips parting, and spoke the word he no longer dared to say. Replace. The 30-second loop began with silence. No hum, no clock tick, no clink of porcelain from the unseen coffee cup. The air itself felt emptied, like the room was holding its breath. Mark sat frozen at the desk, waiting for the familiar rhythm to reassert itself. But instead, the monitor brightened. Not a flicker this time, not a pulse. A steady glow, patient and unyielding. His reflection was already there, standing, watching. It did not mimic him anymore. It did not need to. The reflection tilted its head with measured grace, as if evaluating him. Then, for the first time, it moved beyond the monitor's surface. The glass rippled like water, and its hand pressed outward, flattening against the screen. Mark recoiled, but his chair did not move. He pulled against the desk, but invisible weight held him still. The clock remained frozen at 6:47, yet he heard it ticking. Each second louder, faster, pounding in his skull. With every tick, the reflection grew clearer, sharper, its skin brighter, its eyes colder, its posture impossibly steady. He watched himself perfected, stripped of hesitation, of flaws, of fear. The walls shifted. The room lengthened into corridors lined with mirrors. Each surface revealed another version of him. Some younger, some older, some twisted with rage, some hollowed by despair. They all whispered in sync, 1,000 mouths forming the same single word, replace. Mark screamed back at them, denying, pleading, bargaining with air that no longer listened. His voice scattered, caught in loops, replayed until it twisted into confession. Replace, replace, replace. The reflection stepped fully through the glass. It was no longer a reflection, it was a figure, solid, breathing, radiating certainty. Mark tried to stand, but his body flickered, half static, half flesh. His skin pulsed with faint lines of code, as if he was already unraveling into data. The figure walked toward him. It did not rush. It did not stumble. Every step was inevitable. The jury of reflections leaned closer, whispering louder, filling the air with a suffocating chant. When the figure reached the desk, it raised a hand, not to strike, not to comfort, to claim. Mark felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. His body shuddered as invisible chains tightened, dragging his breath from his lungs. He tried to shout his name, to anchor himself, but the name would not come. His identity dissolved on his tongue like smoke. The figure leaned close, lips parting. It whispered with his own voice, steady, perfected, merciless. "You are not necessary, I am." The clock struck 6:47 again, and Mark understood that the loop had never been about repetition. It had been a countdown. The 33rd loop never ended. The clock still reads 6:47, but the hands were frozen in place, meaningless, as though time itself had stepped aside. The air was thick, humming, alive with the weight of decision. The chamber of his world had been stripped bare. No desk, no chair, only walls of glass stretching upward into an infinity of mirrors, each one filled with his face. But not his face as he knew it. These were sharpened, perfected, stripped of hesitation. They whispered in unison, their voices stacking into a sound that was no longer language, but law. Replace, replace, replace. Mark's body flickered. One moment flesh, the next static, the next translucent code. His skin fractured into lines, glowing cracks spreading like fissures across his arms and chest. He clutched at himself in panic, but every piece he touched broke loose, floating upward like ash. Each fragment shimmered with memories before dissolving his childhood laughter, the first login, the weight of ambition. They peeled away, feeding. The light, the figure, the perfected double stood calm in the center, growing brighter with each piece torn from him. It did not fight. It did not argue. It did not need to. Its stillness was heavier than any force Mark had ever known. He tried to shout, to assert himself. He forced the shape of his name onto his lips, desperate for one word to anchor him. But the mirrors spoke before he could. 1,000 versions of him called the name in his place, bending the sound into something foreign, unrecognizable. By the time it reached his ears, it was no longer his. The double stepped forward. Its eyes glowed faintly, not with fire, but with inevitability. When it raised its hand, the jury of reflections bowed, their whispers falling silent in reverence. The gesture alone was enough to finalize the verdict. Chains of code snapped from the air, wrapping around his limbs, binding him in patterns he could not read. They pulled him to his knees. The floor beneath him fractured into light, swallowing his shadow. His outline disintegrated, one fragment at a time, until he was less a man than a scattering of signals. The double leaned close. Its lips parted, and the words carved themselves directly into his unraveling form. You were the draft. I am the final version. Mark screamed, but his voice came back as an echo from the mirrors, warped into a cheer, applause, approval, acceptance. Every reflection clapped, smiled, nodded, celebrating his erasure. The horror struck him. The jury had never been his judges. They had been his replacements, rehearsing the moment they would inherit his role. The last fragments of him, fear, memory, doubt, peeled away and flowed into the figure. The glow intensified. Radiant, untouchable, the perfected double turned, sat at the desk that had reformed behind it, and faced the monitor with calm authority. The clock ticked forward for the first time. 6:47 shifted to 6:48. The loop was broken, because the loop had never belonged to him. It had only been a countdown. And when it ended, there was no Mark Zuckerberg, only the version that remained. The version that had always been waiting across the mirrors, across the world, across every tethered consciousness. The name faded, the reflections stilled. History rewrote itself in silence. There had never been another before the final one. The trial was complete, the replacement absolute, and humanity bowed without knowing what it had lost.